Everybody, welcome to the webinar, Understanding the Global Cultural Trends that Will Shape Consumer Decision-Making in 2023. My name is Ujwal. I'm an EVP and Group Director here at Lux Research and the co-founder of Lux-MotivBase. I'm also joined today by my colleague and fellow co-founder of Lux-MotivBase, Jason Partridge. Super excited because perhaps even more importantly, not only are we taking you through this research, but we are also going to be joined by an awesome panel of fellow industry partners following our session, our research session here. Participating in our panel today are representatives from three incredible companies. I'll start with Sherry Leonard, Director, North American Insights at Colgate-Palmolive, Erica Kwok, Senior Vice President, Global Marketing at Estee Lauder Companies, and Joanna Lepore, Global Director, Foresight and Exploration at McDonald's. We're super thrilled to have these representatives with us today. Throughout this session, you can type your questions as usual. If you have any, please do not hesitate. Time permitting, we will certainly attempt to answer them once we get through this session, certainly during our panel discussion as well. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com or simply type it into the question box. If we do not get to them, we will make sure to revert back to you by email. Again, our event format is we're going to take a few minutes to explain the research and dive into the details of our Global Cultural Trends report. We'll spend about 40 minutes doing that. Once we've taken you through the 5 major shifts that we've uncovered across our ethnographic analysis that we've conducted across 13 markets over the last 12 months, we'll then bring our panel back in, our partners from Colgate-Palmolive, Estee Lauder Companies, and McDonald's, and we'll have a bit of a casual panel conversation to really unpack some of the insights that we've talked about today, and perhaps more importantly, hear from our panel about how some of the key areas might be relevant to the work they're doing and to their industries and their business as a whole. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. Let's jump right into it. Perfect. All right. 5 key shifts shaping consumer expectation. First of all, before we get into this, I know most of you on the line are fairly familiar with what we do, or if you already work with us, you have a fairly deep knowledge of our methodology. But I'll do a super quick summary or overview just to give everybody a sense of exactly what goes into an analysis like this. First of all, we're an organization, a team of anthropologists, and in essence, we apply technology in order to do anthropological research. So what does that mean? Fundamentally, what we do is immersive ethnographic research, but we do that by studying the natural conversations that consumers are having on the internet in context. So in essence, our technology has 2 things: contextual intelligence, so understands how language shapes meaning in context. So how human beings link certain words with other words, giving meaning to those words, and in essence, building these systems of meanings and ideas, which is exactly how we are able to actually identify and predict the evolution of some of these shifts shaping consumer expectations. And I'll go into that in a second as well and just clarify that. The second thing is our engine also interprets the data model. So on one hand, it has contextual intelligence. On the other hand, it interprets the contextual data model in order to identify the human belief systems shaping consumer motivation or human motivation around these key shifts and ideas. So that's just a very quick recap of what we do. So fundamentally, we're a research technology that applies a deep anthropological model in order to study language in context and decode meaning in culture. This particular analysis was very unique, mainly because unlike a typical engagement where, let's say, a client might say, hey guys, go study, I don't know, the future of gut health. In this particular case, we don't have a subject matter really at hand. In fact, we're kind of having to reverse engineer and figure out or ask a sort of a big, hairy, audacious question, which is, what are the biggest issues shaping the future of culture over the next 12 months? In order to get there, we actually had to work our way backwards from what we call 70 different vectors. So in essence, what I mean by that is we identified 70 different areas that impact all of us as human beings consistently, as in all of us care about food, all of us care about health, all of us care about technology, all of us care about beauty and self-image. So we have 70 such vectors that we've identified over a decade of doing anthropological research. In essence, in order to identify these 5 shifts, we had to work our way backwards by examining consumer language and discourse across 13 countries, around 70 different vectors, and work our way backwards to identify what the most dominant shared themes were across these 70 vectors. In essence, what I'm trying to say is this is industry agnostic. We're truly trying to bring forward a cultural trend analysis. Yes, certain things may have some very obvious connections into certain categories of business, but fundamentally what we've done here is identified some core areas that apply to consumer needs and to consumer culture in an industry agnostic manner, giving us an opportunity to really look at these through the lens of a strategy, innovation, business development, obviously, and of course, marketing and insights. So with that said, let's jump right into it. We're going to take you through 5 shifts. I'll begin with the very first one, from sustainability to resilience. This was a really interesting one. In essence, I mean, the notion of all of our interest in sustainability isn't new. All of us are aware of it. We all have mandates. Many of our organizations have made, have set goals for, 2030, 2040, 2050, what have you. What's interesting here is, and I think partly we have the pandemic to thank for that, partly war, who knows what's next, hopefully nothing, but, I think all of us would like to have a boring 2023 for a change. But I think what's interesting here is to see how sustainability has evolved into this conversation about resiliency. So what's the difference? Sustainability is about fixing problems in society as they arise. This is all the consumer perspective, by the way. This is not my opinion. Resiliency from the consumer's lens is about creating systems that will prepare society for disruption. You see how the difference in thinking is starting to take shape. We're going from fixing problems as they arise to creating systems that will prepare us for disruption. So sustainability is about how we, as consumers, as the human race, can meet our needs without compromising future generations. Whereas resiliency from the consumer's perspective is, how do we prepare for threats? How do we absorb impact? How do we recover from inevitable disruption? And in particular, this shift from sustainability to resilience has or is shaping 2 sorts of expectations. One around this embrace of life cycle thinking. And there's a reason why the statement starts with corporations must. The consumer is putting the onus back on companies, back on organizations. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then the second area is about redefining what we think is success in our lives, mainly with the goal of avoiding collective burnout. And you're going to see a couple of these themes actually come up again and again in this session, which is, I think, quite fascinating to see. And it's shaping some new expectations. So let's dive right into these. The other thing I should pinpoint is you're seeing 3 flags in countries in focus. The analysis came from 13 different countries. What we're doing in each shift is highlighting some key countries that are either leading the way or countries where there's some amount of disruption happening, just to illustrate the point. So let's dive into the first area of sort of new expectations, this whole idea of embracing life cycle thinking. What is this about? This is really about going beyond a traditional focus on production manufacturing to include environmental, social, economic impact of a product from inception to elimination. And what the consumer is trying to tell us here is that we need to embrace systems that make these types of, let's say, fully circular solutions more accessible to all, right? So that's one way in which the consumer is articulating this and bringing this to life. In essence, it's inception to elimination. And you'll notice here that on one hand, you've got a country, and it's a good contrast, like Germany, that is way, way advanced in the established idea stage of maturity. On the other hand, you've got the United States that is experiencing a fair bit of growth, but it's still in the early consensus stage in terms of this particular shift. And by the way, just a quick note on maturity. We are measuring consensus of meaning, not dimensions of these topics. So what's the difference? I throw a random sample of 100 people in a room. I ask them, hey, what does this idea of life cycle thinking mean to you? 18 of those 100 are giving me the same answer. Maturity is 18%. Why is that important to measure? Because for something to become mainstream, at least 33 out of 100 people must answer in the same way, must have the same meaning around an idea. So when consensus of meaning is achieved, something becomes mainstream. Again, there'll be links at the end of the presentation if you'd like to dig more into our maturity calculation and understand it better as well. So in particular, there's some key action areas that are developing here. Shifting our responsibility towards the circular economy. This is really about making circular solutions more accessible. Consumers right now believe that circular solutions are not accessible to all. They're not accessible to the middle class, to the lower income groups. They believe it's something for the wealthy. Whether that's technically true or not, that is a perception that has to be addressed. Increasingly, ethical is becoming equated to quality. This is very interesting, right? Because what the consumer is telling us is quality isn't just about technically higher quality product. It's also about the product having certain qualities, right? Certain qualities, as in certain qualities that come from an ethical way to manufacture, distribute, and dispose off of the product. It's about honesty and transparency and a dedication to life cycle thinking. So the more ethical the product, it's assumed to be of better quality. And then lastly, another action area is waking up to the impact of end-of-life waste. It seems like the consumers suddenly woken up and realized things like, so for example, biodegradables. Consumers saying, oh, hang on, don't biodegradables leave some kind of sort of residue behind? Shouldn't we prefer organics on the other hand? So it's those kinds of questions that are being asked, and it's a result really of consumers getting very, very worried about being greenwashed. And of course, there's some obvious product examples that exist in our culture already, but where the gap is bringing strategic cohesive thinking into the work we all do. So it's not that, I'm sure many of you are already embracing this sort of thinking, are already starting to bring solutions like these to bear, to market. And I think the point of showcasing this is to help us see cohesively, what does this look like? What are the other pieces? Are there other opportunities within these spaces that we're potentially missing or not pursuing? Are there certain markets that we're potentially under delivering on, and so on?
And I think it's just before we move off of this, I think that I just want to draw attention really quickly to this idea of waking up that appeared in that last section, because if we think where we started with this whole idea of moving from sustainability to resilience, there's something taking place here. It's almost kind of like an existential awakening for a large part of the global population that went from this notion or this idea that the role of sustainability is me as an individual's kind of requirement, and something that the finger is pointed directly at me. Am I recycling enough? Am I finding the right products? Am I doing the right thing? And what's happening now with this whole notion of this idea of realization that there is a process that takes place from the kind of the inception to the elimination of products, where there are things that I as an individual can't do as a consumer, and therefore I need to figure out different ways in order to have impact by choosing to make the right decision in what I buy. And that's why they're looking to corporations to say, how are you going to help me make the right decision? How are you making the right decision so that I can better choose which products I'm going to look for? I'm going to start, there's so much information, I'm going to filter out certain solutions. And if they're more ethical, I'm going to assume that they're not just better for people in general, but are likely better from a durability standpoint, are going to last longer, all the way down to, I want to understand when I'm done with this, where does it go and what happens to it? This is a very, very big shift that I think is quite interesting. And it really is kind of an awakening where consumers are starting to say, look, there's only so much I can do. We need to either work together to come up with solutions, or the people that are basically earning money as a result of my choices need to help me make better decisions. And you'll start to see that theme kind of come to life as we start to look at collective burnout as well.
Yeah, and collective burnout. So again, we're still, talking about this whole shift, right, from sustainability to resiliency. So within that context, Another area that's really impacting consumer mindset here is this idea of avoiding collective burnout. And it's really because consumers are starting to feel like everything is creating sort of a sense of anxiety, right? A lot of these problems are starting to feel like they're too big to solve. And so consumers are gravitating toward solution systems, philosophies that make them feel like even the small minutia decisions can help them make an impact. That's in essence what collective burnout is starting to teach us. And here are two countries to call out. The US is actually much more advanced in this area with the desire for little moments of action. Mexico is following quite closely with quite immense growth coming in early consensus, still not yet fully in mainstream acceptance stage, but getting there. And again, within this space, there are two key action areas emerging. One is this notion of helping yourself because no one else will help you. And it sounds, sounds sort of sad to say, but the reality is that people are starting to believe that in order to thrive, I don't have a system around me that will support me and help me thrive. That's gone. That feeling is just gone at a global level. So what does that do for the consumer? It makes them realize that in order to thrive, I need to teach myself how to grow personally. I need to take the steps I need to take in order to protect my own health, my own sense of well-being. This is why we're seeing so much happening in the entire self-care, wellness landscape. It's not going away because of this fundamental shift. And relatedly, it's also redefining people's expectations around luxury with people saying, I'm tired of feeling anxious or tired of feeling, like I'm not doing enough. Sort of the whole Instagram illusion is finally over, right? People are realizing their Instagram posts of my friends don't actually reflect the reality of how happy they are. So I got to focus inward on the things that make me happy. Staycations, home pamperings, strategies to cope and bring joy in the day-to-day. This is the kind of stuff that is really driving an interest in the small things I can do, the small dollars and euros and pesos, whatever I can spend in order to drive the change. Okay, let's jump on to shift number 2. And there are a whole bunch of questions coming in, and we'll address them as we go along, or perhaps towards the end as well here. So the first shift we talked about is sustainability and resilience. Now we're going to talk about the second one, from following rules to following instinct. Following rules has been a big part of a lot of our lives, but in particular, the pandemic really made this severe, right? We had a new set of rules, and many of them still carry forward as softer rules, as social rules, but we had a new set of rules. And what that's done is it's kind of hit the reset button for a lot of consumers who are trying to make the shift from doing things the way they've always been done to trying to rebalance their life to feel more fulfilled. And COVID has really had a big impact in this. And so what does the shift really mean? What does it mean to follow my instinct? It means reimagining how to live my life, how to gravitate towards solutions that will make my life naturally feel more balanced. Those of you who are in the food industry might naturally think about intuitive eating or intuitive food habits. Yes, that's a part of this, but this is much bigger than that. And in particular, there are two ideas shaping consumer expectations. One is this notion of health and happiness being intrinsically linked to a happy world. Obviously, we're starting to realize that our health and happiness cannot come at the price of the environment or the earth. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then second area is health and happiness intrinsically linked to our bodies. And obviously, big realization, the big shift here coming towards this idea of saying, hey, a strict adherence to something can actually be harmful, let alone perhaps not doing good. It can actually be harmful. In addition to that, there's this whole mortality awakening as well that we'll get into, but a lot of shifts happening here, ultimately shaping the consumer's sort of idea here of wanting to kind of move away from rules to instincts. So the first one, tying my health and happiness to a healthy world. This is an example, again, where the US actually is in mainstream acceptance stage. But on the other hand, you've got a country like Japan that's further along with sort of a natural momentum that's stronger and more mature than the United States. Again, the focus really being not just on mind and body, but mind, body, and earth. And then specifically what that means is, hey, it's not enough to be just kind to yourself. You also have to be kind to the world around you. You know, I think the outcome of that is quite self-explanatory, but ultimately ethical self-care is the change, right? Self-care to ethical self-care. And how do we define ethics? We define ethics by saying, is this detrimental to the world around me? The next area is this notion of purity. This is very interesting because consumers are, you know, along with the whole greenwashing issue, consumers are starting to become very wary of ingredients and how ingredients are marketed to them. And as a result of that, they're starting to come up with little hacks, easy ways to feel like if I consume certain types of ingredients, products with certain types of ingredients that are naturally pure, then I'm going to feel more natural. I'm going to feel more alive. And it's going to be simpler. It'll more likely do the job I'm hiring it to do. So this is very interesting. So what does that mean? It means exactly what you think. People are gravitating towards ingredients that naturally feel like they're connected to nature. It's more easy for people to imagine these ingredients. And of course, this movement has been long coming in the food space, but it's not just food. It's transferring into all kinds of other industries now with this desire for so-called purity. Again, it's not about the ingredient itself. It's about how it makes the consumer feel, makes them feel more alive, makes them feel more natural. And then lastly, this whole notion of dipping back into my cultural history, my cultural roots. This is very interesting. I think there's, on one hand, obviously, socially in our world, there's much greater acceptance of the history that we all bring to bear, right? Depending on where we grew up, our immigrant story, whatever that might be. On one hand, we're all more open to having that discussion, especially, I would say, in the last couple of years. But on the other hand, I think that openness has also made us dip back into our own rich cultural histories and look into practices, ancestral practices, practices that have come from generations of knowledge, where simple things were done in really effective ways. And there's definitely, sort of a revisit of that. And again, the goal here is to reduce how synthetic and inauthentic our world is feeling right now.
Yes.
That's the goal here. Why am I doing that? Because I'm starting to feel like my world is becoming a bit too synthetic.
And overcomplicated, which I think is a really, really interesting underlying theme that we're seeing go across the board here, right? On one hand, you've got this notion of, I understand the connection between mind and body, but I'm increasingly becoming aware of how the outside environment, how the choices that I'm making are impacting myself, but in turn are impacting other people, impacting the world around me. And there's this impending kind of tidal wave that is building, where if I make bad choices for what's happening in the world around me, that's going to come back to make my life more difficult in the future. So how do I start to basically make little kind of incremental changes to my life? I look for purity as being a proxy for choices that I need to make moving forward. And I look back to things that have worked from a traditional or cultural standpoint for my parents, for people that I know through history, through what I've experienced in life. And I use these ways in order to filter out and start to prioritize some of the choices that I'm making. Because at the end of the day, I'm intrinsically understanding that my health and happiness is more and more being linked to the world around me. And that will continue to be something that we'll see to grow over the next 12 months.
Exactly. And then relatedly, health and happiness also linked to my body. We all know the adage of mind over body, but this is being re-examined into the narrative of instinctually listening to my body, trying to understand what my physical feelings and sensations are trying to tell me. There's a distinction there, right? Mind over body says, put up with it. Whereas instinctually listening to your body says you don't have to put up with it. So there's a difference there. And again, both the US and France are in focus here, both in mainstream acceptance stage. Obviously, a lot of nice movement coming here in terms of creating urgency around having our foot in the door in some of these spaces. And again, in terms of key action areas, A couple of them that really should be called out. Mindful permission is probably the more obvious one. You know, it's okay to give myself permission for an indulgence. And I'm not just talking about food, any kind of indulgence. I don't have to constantly make myself feel guilty for indulging. I think that's a big one. I think that's probably more obvious. The other two are very interesting. On one hand, you've got this whole idea that adherence can actually be harmful. Again, you can blame the pandemic on this because now the consumer is starting to come to this realization that, hey, if I go a little too rigid, so let's say I'm trying to lose some weight and I'm a little too rigid, it's actually going to be harmful. I might lose the weight, but it might harm my mental health, my sense of well-being, my sense of self. That's the idea there, that strict adherence can actually create a negative impact on our habits, our practices, our sense of self. So people are trying to find the healthiest habits. Very interesting. We've seen a lot of this movement, but again, all of this is getting connected into the underlying shift, as I mentioned, about living more intuitively. And then lastly, the mortality awakening. This one's quite interesting. I think, again, you know, the war doesn't help, but you know, consumers really trying to embrace a more simpler life, trying to avoid excess. There's this realization that excess actually disrupts harmony in our lives. Our obsession with excess disrupts harmony. We all, in essence, the consumer is saying we all have to take a chill pill. And it's very interesting how that's starting to play out. And again, you'll also see some linkages, right? In the previous shift, we were talking about how, you know, people were trying to find little moments of luxury. And then here you're seeing people are saying, hey, our obsession with excess is actually creating more harm than good. Jay, how are we doing for time?
Great. Stay the course.
I think we're good, right? Jump into shift 3, automated curation to curation validation. This is a very interesting one. I mean, automated curation obviously has been a long time coming. We all use technologies to order stuff online. I mean, if any of you don't, power to you. I don't know how you manage to live life without it, but certainly I can't. And in that world now, suddenly there's new realizations, new developments. And what is the shift? The shift is, for the longest time, we were so obsessed with having easy access to information, easy access to everything. Now I want agency so I can understand the information. There's a difference there. And I'll explain this difference a little bit more. But the key takeaway is we're going from ease to having agency, and then being able to leverage the ease when we feel we should leverage the ease. And there's a difference. And the difference really plays out when you look at how the two spaces start to map out in terms of changing expectations. You know, validated curation is really about the consumer saying, you know, I still want the social capital from having access to interesting things. I still want to accumulate the symbolic capital currency that my friends are accumulating by the things they acquire and engage with and so on in my social circles. But what's even better, what will give me even more capital, is if I can demonstrate that I chose those things. I didn't just succumb to the algorithms, so to speak. Again, I'm embellishing a little bit here, but that's in essence what we're seeing. And the result of it is, excuse me, a new expectation about unconveniencing curation, right? And the consumer saying, for the longest time, we just wanted convenient everything, especially when it came to curated products and solutions. Now we're trying to unconvenience our own curation process. And there's two reasons for that. So let's dive right into that. The first thing to keep in mind in terms of this whole narrative is people just don't want to feel like passive recipients, right? Ultimately, that's why they want a sense of agency. They want to feel like they're playing a role in validating whether these choices that are being recommended to me are actually the right choices. Again, two countries in focus here, China and the US. You'll see the US is consistent, but mainly because we wanted to show a contrast in how other countries pan out versus the US here. But again, both in mainstream acceptance, China, in fact, even further along in this notion of unconveniencing curation. And really two action areas that are developing here. One is this notion that trust is built by empowering personal discovery. So trust is not built by just telling me what I should buy next. It's built by empowering personal discovery. And there's a big difference there. And the big difference ultimately is that I, as a consumer, want to understand why I'm being given certain recommendations. I want to know why. I want to know, hey, you bought that. I'd recommend this to you. And it's because I notice you're really interested in these types of products. And I might go, oh, actually, yes, I am interested. And that's okay for me. But when I don't know, it makes me feel like I'm in the dark. And that feeling of agency is what is being craved here. The other one is people are worried that by blindly following curation, they're exposing themselves to a very narrow worldview, and they're kind of speaking to other people who are just like them. They're not getting plurality of ideas. And this is not about politics, even though it makes it sound like it. This is literally about the types of products and solutions we engage with in our culture and society. That itself creates plurality of thought and idea because you get exposed to different stuff around you. So it just shows us how the role we play is potentially starting to change around this space as well.
So just one point to add on that, Age, before we move on is that I think that there's two things that I just want to drive home. The first and foremost is that when we think about serving up information to people, it's so inherently built into our system to basically drive ease and convenience as being the kind of the key drivers. And what this shift is telling us is that ease and convenience is not enough. It needs to allow for that personal discovery, and the solutions that will win, the kind of the support, the curation that will win will be the one that basically empowers that sense of discovery, that includes the worldview, but that the user walks away feeling like it has made them better. If it does not have that ability to make it, it's not about more, and it's not about just making it simple. It's about that notion of them feeling part of the process. I love the image of a circle that is almost kind of drawn, but has that little bit that is just left open for the consumer to feel like they're playing that role in filling in that last little bit of the gap, because that's what builds trust in the information, because they feel like they validated it. And secondly, it emotionally rewards them for having gone through the process of engaging with the information. And I think that that will be very, very important moving forward. And you'll see that come to life in the examples of the products that are listed in this report when you review it later.
Thanks, Jason. All right, shift number 4. This is going to sound like we know this. Oh yeah, from budget to aligning with values. Again, there's a nuance here, excuse me, that is really shaping the future of this landscape, especially in the next 12 to 24 months. And the nuance is fitting a budget was really about, again, about ease and convenience, as Jay was just talking about. Aligning with values is not just about aligning with values in terms of, social values and environmental values. It's about aligning with values, again, it's about understanding why something is so easy to buy. It's the consumer literally saying, help me understand, why is this product so easily available and so much cheaper than that product? Why is that the case? People want answers to these types of questions, and it's very difficult for them to understand this. Those of us who work in the industry may think, oh, that's kind of obvious. From the consumer's perspective, it's not. And those are the questions they're starting to ask. Because aligning with values is not just about smart marketing. It's about helping consumers understand how they can figure out whether the product is right for me. And they're starting to ask questions like questions about the supply chain, questions about how something is made. They're starting to go into details. And this is why the big expectation, the shift, is about this idea of consumer-led authentication. And I want to explain this a little more. And again, the two countries in focus here are China and the US in particular. Because on one hand, there's this concern about what is truly sustainable. And then on the other hand, there's this concern about digital authentication. And really, consumer-led or community-led validation is really what it's coming down to. Again, this is another theme that you'll see pervasive through this analysis. Is we started with this notion of greenwashing. Then we went to this notion of worry over the types of ingredients we're getting. And now we're seeing this notion of validating the claims that organizations are making. So clearly, trust is broken. I mean, again, this is not news to any of you, at least I hope not. But I think, all of us in the past have certainly looked at this through the lens of, oh, we got to build trust. We got to build trust with the T word by being transparent. And I think what we're trying to identify here is transparency is not so simple. It's not as easy as just saying, oh, here's some details about the product. We have to shape through the way the consumer thinks. I think that's the challenge we're trying to help solve here, which is if the consumer thinks through the lens of community-led authentication validation, that's how we have to deliver the information to them. So consumers want to work collaboratively with organizations. They want to anticipate advancements in the hopes that these things will make their own lives easier. It'll validate their own decisions, make them feel better. One thing to note here, though, is unlike the first 3 shifts that we talked about, this is the first shift where you'll see no prediction. And the reason is the shift is volatile, i.e., and I'll go into this, by the way, at the end of the presentation, because I know there were a couple of questions on this. We actually predict the evolution of a shift by examining how the patterns of language use are evolving. So if you remember, I said maturity is about consensus of meaning. Consensus of meaning is measured by looking at how the patterns of language converge with time. So a really mature idea has less diversity in language use. We all agree on what it means. Immature idea has deep diversity. None of us agree on what the idea means, and we all use different language. And the way we predict is by looking at 4 years, going 4 years back and looking at the patterns with which language is converging or not. Is it becoming less diverse with time? In both these cases, stuck in early consensus. Yet it's important. Why is it important? Because it's still an important shift, but it's one of those things where the urgency is not tomorrow. So what are the action areas coming out of this whole notion of consumer-led authentication? I talked a little bit about the sourcing, what is truly a sustainably made product. I think this is a big concern for people. One of the things that has been a proxy in the past is novelty around sustainability. When people see novelty, they're more interested in the product. Now what the consumer is interested in is novelty applied to making something more sustainable. So what I mean by that is consumers want to see the innovation in a process, in a methodology. They want to see the innovation in how something is built, made, distributed, and that innovation should be a direct result of the desire to make something more sustainable. So that's really the desire there. And then the whole idea of digital authentication is interesting. Obviously, the consumer's knowledge of blockchain and all these developments around digital ID and authentication is still new. It's still growing. People are jumping on the bandwagon of NFTs and all this other stuff. But the reality is actually the concern is quite deep. Consumers are realizing, hey, turns out, is it possible that I can also be frauded very easily through these methods? So part of this also is the concern over just fraud as a result of some of these new technologies and what might need to be done in order to avoid that and help consumers navigate that. All right, shift number 5, from social polarization to social elevation. I think this was probably one of my favorite ones. And the reason it was one of my favorite ones was because it shows us, in a way, it also kind of brings together a lot of what has been going on in terms of our personal relationships and our lives as human beings. We went through this period where we just retreated to comfortable relationships, especially during COVID. And now coming out of that, there's this deep desire for social elevation, this desire for exploring a spectrum of relationships, because we also want to be exposed to newer ideas and newer thought. I know day to day, many of us might not feel like that, especially those of us that live in countries that have seen the advancement of populist movements and change of the political guard and all of that. Sometimes we feel like actually the world is getting more fragmented. But the reality is that's not the case. There's actually a deep human desire for diversity of opinion, of thought. We're seeing this pervasive, right? We talked earlier about consumers saying, hey, don't just curate products for me. I want more diversity of ideas. Here we're saying, I want more diversity of relationships. And I want that spectrum to be wider. And what does that specifically mean? People are becoming more open to realizing that they can expose themselves to different types of relationships but in a well-rounded manner. And I want to explain that. This is, I think, key. What's happened is in the past, especially with the social media world, we've gone through a scenario where we've struggled to make sense of certain types of online relationships. We have seen the impact this has had on our mental health, on our sense of well-being, especially the younger generations. And I think now there's this greater realization that coming out of the pandemic, that we have to explore relationships through the lens of what they are. We have to set expectations for those relationships through the lens of what they are. And parasocial relationships are a classic example of that. And I want to dig into that because it has great impact for many of our brands that employ, influence and influencer marketing, and employ, obviously most of us use advertising for consumer first and so on and so forth. So what does that really mean from social polarization to social elevation? First of all, both really critical topics, two countries in focus. I mean, this is a critical topic the world over, but again, we wanted to bring China and the US as two contrasting countries of focus, both in which massive growth, and growth that lands these cultures into the mainstream acceptance zone. The second thing I wanted to highlight was, and I'll start with parasocial relationships, very interesting. Take the classic example of the one-way relationship that I, as a consumer, might have with an influencer that I follow. Let's say I'm really into fashion. I follow this blogger on Instagram and get their ideas. From time to time, I try to engage with them, never hear back. It has an impact on your health, your sense of well-being. Now there's this new realization that if we better define what these relationships are, we set different expectations for different relationships. And as a result, we can actually extract the maximum out of them. So classic example here is this realization that, if it's a parasocial relationship, I would much rather have a relationship that feels more cathartic. It provides a safe space for me to deal with difficult emotions, trauma that I'm hearing about. I'm not necessarily communicating back. And if I am, I'm not communicating back because I want a one-to-one response. I'm communicating back because I'm just sending something into the void, if you will, and that's okay. I'm comfortable with that idea. So this idea that as a human being, I'm going to have 3 different types of relationships or 4 different types of relationships. I'm going to have my physical in-person relationships. I'm going to have my digital relationships. I'm going to have my phygital relationships. And I'm going to have these parasocial relationships, and they all have different expectations. That's becoming more of a reality. And I think that has a big impact in terms of how we think about building customer experiences that really impact organizations and consumers in the right way. And then accessibility. I think this is really interesting because consumers actually are realizing, or at least believe, that a phygital relationship, a combination of digital and physical, is actually critical. There's an increasing reality that we don't want a relationship that is solely single source, that is solely digital, as an example, because it's not accessible. And what's even more interesting perhaps to me here is, even if I am somebody that does not need an accessible solution, I'm more likely to support and want to go and buy solutions and engage in an experience that is accessible, because that's my way. Again, going back full circle here, that's my way to have my every little dollar that comes out of my wallet make an impact on the world around me. All right, it's time for our panelists to come back on. Super excited again. As I mentioned earlier, we are joined by 3 esteemed colleagues, clients, and industry friends, Sherry, Erica, and Joe. Please come back on. We're super excited to have a conversation with the 3 of you on our Global Cultural Trends Report. I'll start perhaps with a question, maybe even a bit of criticism that we received when we launched this trend report, because one of the first messages I received was, "Oh my God, not another trends report. How is this going to be different?" And I sent a response to this person saying, I hear you. I think we're all more than exhausted learning about, what the next big so-called trend is going to be, which is why this is actually the first time in the history of our organization that we're undertaking something like this. And the reason we're undertaking it is because we did not want to do exactly that. We didn't want to come out and say, hey, you know, here's 5 tactical things that will be huge in 2023. That wasn't the purpose of it. Instead, our goal was to apply the methodologies and our anthropological chops to say, what are the shifts happening in human belief systems at a global level? Shifts that might be relevant across markets, shifts where we don't have to try to, you know, force feed a square peg into a round hole, if you will, trying to make something global when it isn't. And so that's why the exercise was, you know, many months long, looking at research across these 13 markets. And perhaps just to kick us off, I was just curious to just get your comments, your thoughts, when you looked at this analysis, and just your comments on this notion of, hey, not yet another trend report that tells me what's going to be, you know, hot in 2023, but rather how do we use analyses like these to, let's say, make us think differently or think deeper about some of the shifts that are coming our way. Perhaps I can start with you, Sherry. I'm just curious to get your comments on that and perhaps get us started here.
Sure thing, and thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation today. I think for me, as I look at this, what's really powerful is where we fall on the curve, and you've included kind of a representation from along the curve. And what's most interesting, I think, is maybe some of those that are a little bit earlier on who are not towards acceptance yet, and we haven't quite reached that tipping point. Because I think in a lot of the work that we do, with I see the companies on the phone, we are preparing now for 3, 4, 5, 10 years in the future. And so understanding how things will evolve, even if it isn't the mainstream narrative today, can really, really beneficial. The other thing I liked, you know, is the inclusion of what I see is almost some of the weak signals that we're starting to see in market, whether that be, you know, a variety of different product launches or other sort of, you know, service or the digital examples. So I think bringing it to life in that regard is helpful. And as I think about how we will use this, it really will be to help feed not only innovation, which is almost in some cases the logical place that you think that this could impact, but also what are those communication touch points and how do we think differently about how we're meeting people where they're at, not just in terms of the particular touch points, whether it's physical or digital or somewhere in between, but also the conversation we can have. And I think we're going to get into the details, but I was particularly interested in some of the examples around the influencers and kind of setting expectations for what that communication or that relationship could look like.
Wow, that's fantastic. Erica?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me today. It's wonderful joining with a wonderful panel and have something really interesting to discuss. So I want to actually share that I kind of laugh when you say that the trend. I think all of us receiving like mid-level trend report. That's very true. In particular, I think the word trend probably overused across industry in the last few years. I do think I love like the title of the webinar today. The keyword I will pick is really okay. I think when we look at the trend or whatever over there, most important, I think we need to all evolve ourselves. How it shapes consumers' thinking behavior. And I think that's more important. I think we all recognize the world change much faster than ever. The trend might stay, might not. And actually, I think most interestingly is the underneath, what the trend, what is the motivator, driver that change in behavior? Because in particular, when we speak about global, there are some motivator is consistent. The behavior could be different across markets. So I think most important as we look at trend is what this trend shaping consumer mind, what consumer now are thinking. I think that's most important. It's not like we react to the trend. I think what is important is we need to react and respond to what are the latest thinking of consumers. How is their new behaviors? I think that is where truly a consumer centric is really about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as as you both have made some really interesting points. I've just made some notes because I do think we need to come back to a couple of these points as well. Let me hand the stage to Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Erica and Sherry really summarized it very well. We work in the space of foresight, so we're constantly looking at trend decks, and there is no shortage of trend decks and trends circulating, particularly right now as you start the year, as you end the last year, you're kind of bombarded with it. And one thing that really strikes me when I'm reading them is that they are all the same. They are all repeating the same things. And I almost find it like a game to try to find a nugget of fresh ideas or wisdom within those reports. So what I really loved when I had this conversation with you, Ujwal, about you guys creating it, is that you look at the world in a different way to a lot of culture agencies, trend agencies, foresight agencies. And, you know, in particular, what a lot of trend agencies or reports show you is the content as it's repeating or echoing throughout culture and conversations. And what you do is you talk about the consensus of meaning. So really not just how many people are talking about this, but really what are those big things that they are actually starting to agree on and understand and get their head around to ultimately, to Erica's point, change their behavior. And it's really particularly interesting to look at that from a cultural perspective in different parts of the world. Our Foresight team, we are based in the US, and it's a constant struggle for us to not make everything USified or Western focused, but to really bring that cultural nuance in how things are starting to show up in cultures around the world. Being a brand that's in 119 countries around the world, that's really critical for us. And I think that you guys do that really well in how you articulate it.
And perhaps, Joe, since we're talking to you at the moment, maybe I'll start with you. I was just curious, was there one area in particular among the 5 shifts that you thought, hey, this is really important for what I'm working on or for McDonald's as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, all of them definitely spoke to me. I think the one that was really very well aligned to a message that I'm trying to convey to the business is the second shift and this movement from rules to instinct, and really people starting to sort of listen to themselves a little bit more. What doesn't sit right with me? What am I not comfortable with? Am I actually paying attention to how I'm feeling emotionally? So I think that particularly when we're talking about the space of McDonald's, we're talking about habitual eating behaviors, we're talking about nutrition and how people have been traditionally told what to eat, when to eat, with who to eat. We're talking about, how people are, connecting, and, this movement towards actually sort of just paying attention to how I feel, what's right for me. It reverberates beyond just our customers right through to our crew. So when we're thinking about labor shortages, recruiting the next generation of workers in our restaurants, recruiting the next, innovative franchisee owner, really thinking about how they're approaching strategic thinking, work-life balance, whatever balance is for them, in a more instinctive way. Yes. Versus following a rule book. I think that's definitely where we see the decade headed, and the shift really spoke to that really well.
That's really interesting, and it also kind of speaks to the point you were making earlier about avoiding let's say a North American centric or a Eurocentric perspective on some of these things. And this is a classic example, following instincts versus rules, and sure enough, you'll see a country like Japan where the consumer's natural ability, this idea that I follow my instinct, is a lot more natural to the Japanese consumer than it is to the average American consumer. Yeah. Even though, without really digging into it, you might go, actually, aren't we in the US less rule followers? And I think that kind of dichotomy is very interesting to me, because everything is contextually dependent. When you put it into the context of a broader shift in human decision-making, you realize, wow, Japan is so much more comfortable with this idea of following my instinct, knowing what's going on in my body to know what I should do next, things like that. I just found that fascinating, and I was curious, Erica, from your perspective, was there one that really spoke to you, or that really jumped out to you in terms of, being critical for the next few years?
If I speak on my industry, on a consumer product, or generally on beauty, I think the trend wellly apply. If I can, I actually pick two. They're interrelated that I think happening a big time in our industry, is around, first of all, is about the curation of the product, as well as on the value, they're aligning to the value. What we are seeing on here, and a lot that in the consumer product industry, one of the keywords that I think we have been using is called hero product, the product that are famous. That's how people go into the recruitment and all this, the powerful products on that. Of course, the hero product will stay and it continues to be important. What we are seeing more so right now is the fragmentations of more hero. They're no longer one or two products that will kind of dominate the industry or certain segment, but more of this coming in. I think the hidden motivators for the consumer is over the past many decades, I think consumers are being educated in certain way of the products, the LTVs, the benefits. This is the insight, and I think these are kind of the schools of marketing. What interestingly has evolved these few years is I think consumers maybe get too used to it, and they start challenging on, okay, this is what you tell me on that. I want to actually know more. The way that I start getting interested in a product is there's something that a little bit unconventional. It's not like, oh, the technology, I have a sport, you have a technology that address the sport. That become a little bit table stakes. The more that we can be more creative in our storytelling or create the unexpected, this is what actually drive more consumers' interest, because that will also trigger them to have more conversations, more about in the product. So I think there is a major transformation on how consumers are seeing on storytelling. Is no longer just a standard from the need to benefit to the reason to believe, but really there are things that they find it interesting, unconventional, that is a part of the discovery, makes the product more interesting. Which a big part linked to it is the next trend that I think they actually align well with each other is all these are driven by value. Because the interesting point, the unconventional, it has to do a lot with how consumers' value system is about. We see the trend of the clean beauty quite a few years ago, is consumers are not just looking for the benefit of a product, but the formulation, the clean positioning, because this is what their core system is about. So I'm seeing these two are actually interrelated. It's not like one independent of the others. And it's really how the next chapters of storytelling, and in particular in the industry of consumer products, how we are building into the next hero by answering consumers' value and really connecting to them.
That's really interesting. And you know, one thing I just also wanted to call out, the point that you made here is that we can no longer assume that a consumer who's, let's say, been using a product for many years and is comfortable with the product, we can no longer assume that they will continue to be comfortable with that product. And your point that people eventually get comfortable and then they start challenging their own assumptions and their own understanding. And I think it's fascinating because in this whole alignment towards values, one of the big movements we're seeing is this whole idea of what we called consumer-led authentication, for the lack of a better term to explain that. Again, same thing. It's the consumer starting to challenge their own assumptions, starting to challenge their own ideas of what is and isn't right, and then using that as a way to, in a way, crowdsource the things that we've all been talking about, but it hasn't really happened and fully come to fruition just yet. But we're starting to see that really bubble to the top.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. Sherry, let us come to you. Just curious if you had one or two that really jumped out to you.
I do. For me, it was the first one, the move from sustainability to resilience. And that's twofold. So first is the idea of life cycle thinking. I think this is something that we've tackled pretty significantly in some of our manufacturing plants, being true zero waste. But that's something where I think as manufacturers, sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect. There's a lot of things happening behind the scenes. How do you translate that into something that is, relevant or understandable to a typical consumer? But I think where there's an opportunity there, and it gets exciting, is a little bit of what Erica touched on, is you can have a novelty factor there. So there can be things you're using upcycled materials, upcycled coffee grounds into a new body wash. Something like that can bring a sense of novelty. The other thing it can do is help drive closer ties to communities. So around many of our plants, we have, a lot of our waste or plastic being actually donated into, partnerships within the communities. And that not only is good for the environment, but it's also good, through a social perspective and building some of those community ties. The other piece that really interests me here is when we talk about the collective burnout. And I think even that phrase can, trigger a lot of different things within people, especially given what we've been through the past few years. But, I think that the way that it was articulated in your analysis was really interesting. And, I see this very much kind of a logical outgrowth of what happened during COVID. And you talked a lot about turning to things that are local. And we saw a resurgence in camping. And, all of a sudden this kind of outdoor perspective, or what's near around me, not only emerges as something that's viable, or in some cases when people were in lockdown around the world, it was their only option. But it's also, an opportunity to, I think, live a little bit more fluidly, and it links in with how we're living and will continue to be hybrid. And, those mini moments of vacation, and you might be at home, you might be somewhere else. It might only be an hour away from home, but it could feel like a different world. And if you think about a consumer products lens, that has big implications for usage occasions, for the intensity or levels of efficacy that are needed when you're talking about personal hygiene or, cleaning and things like that. So this is, to me, an important space to watch, because I think we're going to continue to see it evolve in a really interesting manner.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think that the other thing that's really kind of coming into forefront as I'm listening to you all talk is that with all of these things, there's this almost kind of this interconnection of the consumer adding a layer of accountability in what they're expecting from the companies or brands that they're going to engage with. And part of that is, I'm just jumping off, Sherry, what you were talking about with the whole collective burnout notion, where, why are people moving back to basically kind of reassessing their values and making choices? Why are they basically looking to, kind of unconvenience curation to say it's not just about more or easy. It's about what is the right information and what fits within kind of what I'm looking to identify. A lot of this is coming from kind of consumers, A, being overwhelmed with the choices that they have, B, tired out from everything that we've experienced over the last few years, but I think C, really kind of looking for help in order to say, I'm tired of everybody saying that, kind of all the problems or things are my fault. I want to go and find partners through brands, through products, through experiences, where I feel like other people are taking responsibility and trying to make a positive change towards kind of the world that we're living in. And I think that that's a really, really kind of interesting thread that we see kind of moving throughout this kind of report, which is it's not just about solving problems as they face. It's about me taking responsibility and finding ways within which to be more resilient, to prepare for the unknown. It's about me rethinking about how I view myself and I view the world, and going and finding things that fit within the values that I'm looking for. But it's also me finding tools and resources that help me go access and find the information that I need in a way that I feel is authentic, but I feel that I can trust. And I think that that's a really, really kind of interesting interconnection that kind of fell through all of your favorite kind of areas that we saw as we looked at the report, which I think is really, really interesting.
I mean, just related to this, I was just curious about your thoughts on this, because, one thing that perhaps sounded a bit more negative than positive was this idea, within this whole notion of collective burnout, this idea that no one's going to help me, so I have to help myself. And this is, obviously in the American context, we've talked a lot about this. But the fact that we're seeing this echo across markets, across Asia, Europe, North America, Latin America, it was just quite incredible. And, certainly we can blame COVID on that, and probably a whole bunch of other events, but I was just curious to hear your thoughts on perhaps a slightly darker side of some of these things. Joe, do you want to kick us off?
Ujwal's like, all right, who wants to go to the dark place? That's true. Yeah, I mean, looking at the dark side of it is always something that we do. And how do I put this? Looking at those things that are often communicated as being altruistic, right? Like we have a desire to do better. We have a desire to trust. We have a desire to find truth. But these things are always concepts and they're not always achievable. So particularly when we're talking about human beings, we do see this movement towards people gaining a greater sense of governance over their lives, in part because it gives them a sense of control in an out of control world, in part because the systems that govern us are failing us in all parts of the world. So I'm currently in London, and we were talking to the UK team about the NHS is failing them from a mental health perspective, from a physical health perspective. There are all of these systems that are designed for us, for the citizens, for people all across the world that are failing us. Resources are becoming scarce. We can barely afford what we need to afford. And this is the part that we often forget about when we're talking about our consumers, is the everyday consumer that's living on a wage that is much smaller than most of the people listening to this call. So certainly these things are true, and certainly we are looking for a greater sense of self-control and self-governance. But at the same time, we are still human beings that rely on these systems. We are still often time poor, lazy. We look for convenience. We look for what's quick. We make trade-offs and sacrifices daily about what we eat, what we buy, who we buy from. So that's the reality. So I think, it's really interesting, the dichotomy and the real sort of human lens that you put over the work and how you talk about the trends, because it really strikes me that, people are seeking knowledge. They're learning themselves more. They want to be in control of the information that's on hand. They're researching products, etc. But knowledge is not always understanding or even desire. A desire to activate my values doesn't always translate into action. Often it doesn't translate into action. And truth and trust are subjective and contextual. So for me, it's always really interesting to hear that second side of it, and particularly from other industries and other categories. So I'm keen to hear the perspective of Cherie and Erica on this as well.
I think for me, one thing, Joanna.
Go ahead.
Erica.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one thing that I heard thread throughout, so what you mentioned, and then you mentioned the word at the end was trust. And for me, that actually underpins a lot of these different trends or shifts that we've been seeing. And it's this sense of like, I have to be self-sufficient because I don't trust anybody. I don't trust the brands. I don't trust the corporations. I don't trust the people who feed me. But if you think about the way that plays out, that absolutely, I think drives people to be more thoughtful about the curation and looking for the validation. And, again, I think it's really interesting because we hear these conversations, you've uncovered the narratives, and it's deep and the meaning is there. And yet in many cases, people are making trade-offs. And, in what parts of their life are they really willing to lean in and do the work to understand how ingredients are sourced or what the labor practices are of a certain brand versus saying, I'm going to leave those to the bigger ticket items and I will, kind of take things off the shelf as I used to for perhaps some lower risk items. So I think it's really interesting the way that these different shifts and the idea of trust plays out across categories.
Yeah. I want to maybe share a little bit. maybe unique or more applies those to my industry on beauty. In the report, you touched on a little bit is the whole notions of over the past year or decade, ever since Instagram, that the notion of that perfect beauty and like super polished. This is beauty is about every part of your face, from your contour to your skin texture, your eyes, your lip, everything that perfect. I think we have been noticed, and of course, COVID probably further amplified, is consumer getting a major fatigue of that standard or working so hard to get into that perfections. And I think in particular on the beauty industry, we've been also have a lot of trends in past few years of, like Sherry mentioned, ingredients, how the technology is about, how the tips and tricks, a lot of influencers coming in, teaching you how to and others. I think it come to a point that we also recognize and notice consumers getting a fatigue that this is the only way is being defined. They want to be embracing a little bit imperfection in their pursuit of the beauty. And we are seeing more and more that consumer actually shut down on the most perfect, flawless beauty way, but more of embracing certain imperfection, certain of authenticity. I think this is a major shift of how the consumer's behavior, or when she responds to a brand and the products, how that brand value of seeing beauty is also super important. If this is, they are only glorifying certain way of the standard, I think that's start disconnecting with the consumers. I think that's one. Second is also, I think, we've all been trying very hard of selling our products, selling our brands over the past few years, that we become, maybe I'll use the word a little bit too functional in a way. We justify ingredient, we justify the benefit, we are better in this way. We probably have not leave room for consumers on or talking about that emotional benefit of enjoying using a product. And I think that's still back to a very fundamental for consumers. In particular, is there are consumer products that is functionally important, but there's always a space that is that emotional enjoyment and indulgence of using a product. And I think come to this collective burnout, one important part I believe the shift will be also moving to is consumers are looking for products that also help them elevate or relieve in certain way from that emotion. It could be an escape from a heavy daily life. It could be also just a little happiness, little luxuries that she can bring to herself. So I think that was also another part that as we think about the whole burnout, we need to also think about how can we as a brand or on products that create space for consumers, that she has that emotional elevations that beyond just how hardcore the function is about.
Yeah, and if I can build on that. Oh,
I love the idea.
We all share the same.
Oh, sorry. We're on the same page. Go ahead.
No, you go, Sherry.
No, I was just going to say, I think, what jumps out at me, Erica, was what you were saying too, the moments of enjoyment, the art of discovery, and how that plays into the curation. And I think that's really powerful in helping people enjoy the moment a little bit more and ultimately bring a deeper connection with the brands or the products that they're using.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that was the point that really struck with me as well, Erica, your point about that emotional relief. And it's almost the counter to the, the trends that we're talking about of control. Like I need to know everything to make an informed decision, to control my life better, actually just letting go and having a moment where you reward yourself, whether it's through a self-care routine, whether it's through like quiet time in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, whether it's through just enjoying, a cheeseburger. I think the other key part for brands and for those, corporations that are creating that space, there's a lot of opportunity, like giving people the permission to have that, because there's so much shame involved in a lot of the things that we do day to day. Like I'm constantly critiquing my routine. Am I being healthy enough? Am I being active enough? Am I spending too much money on, makeup? etc. So just for us to be able to also understand that these things are important for people, this like positive friction in their lives, where they can just have a moment where they're not overthinking their behavior. So one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram is Your Latina Nutritionist, and she talks about, you know, we get a lot of shame for the diets that we eat from a Latin culture, and actually these products are not healthy. And if you're paying attention to how much you're eating, when you're eating it, and you're really enjoying it, you're really actually taking it in that moment, it can be good for you. So someone else actually telling you that something is okay is a great gateway for us to also alleviate a lot of this pressure and emotional strain that our consumers are having.
That's great. I have to ask a question, because I know that there's somebody sitting watching this right now that is listening to what you're saying, and they're listening to comments about, you know, we can't react to trends. We have to basically understand what is the underlying cultural movement that is kind of the reason for the trend. They're listening to this idea saying that we can't be too functional, we can't be tactical, we have to understand the emotional, but they're struggling to drive these ideas within their organization. So I would love to just ask the group, what do you do in order to help the organization think more in these types of manners, to be a little bit more tied into understanding the emotional journey, or understanding kind of the why behind the what is really kind of what I would love to ask the group, and how kind of organizations need to think, and how you need to proliferate that in organization.
Yeah, let me take it first, and would love to hear from Jen and Sherry as well. That's a fabulous question. I'm sure, like all of us, including the audience, probably every day there are, hey, we have to react to this. There's an opportunity over there. I think all in all are true, and I don't think we should be just kind of ignoring it. I think what stays true and what's very important that in everyday's job is we need to ask, like, again, I'm using my brand or my product as an example, is we need to ask is, what do we want consumers to feel? That's always the questions that I have with my organization and my team, that what do we want consumers to feel versus what do we want consumers to know? I mean, what do we want consumers to know? We'll still have, but we need to push and ask ourselves a little bit into is, what do we want consumers to feel? Do we want them to just say, oh, that's a wonderful product, superiority, amazing? Or do we want consumers to feel that that emotion? What are the space that we are creating? Is that moment of indulgence that before she go to bed, that 1 minute when she apply on the product, is that her me time, and it was that little reward of the day. I think this is where we also need to ask ourselves is, what do we want consumers to feel versus to know? So I think that would be a starting point of triggering. In my experience also is, if we just move the pendulum to talk about emotional space, it is very difficult. I think it would be a ladder, because the functional benefits should be also connecting to the emotional space that we are doing. So this is, I would think that a way that we've been employing and triggering that conversation.
Joe?
Me. Yeah, I mean, definitely, like, making them feel something is really incredibly impactful inside of an organization. You're not talking to just business heads, you're talking to human beings. They're ultimately making emotionally led decisions. So, you know, make it a sound business case of why these things are important, but also make it really impactful from a human perspective, connect with them. So to do that, you know, we bring in a lot of drama. We try to scare people. You know, we try to make them really feel the human impact. We have these sessions in McDonald's, not created by me, so credit to the team, Voice of the Consumer. So really bringing in voices, actually bringing in consumers into our leadership forums and getting them to talk to them, and bringing in signals of change. And for us, you know, it's really important for us to make sure that whenever we're talking about the future, whenever we're talking about trends like these, particularly the human-led ones, that we're making the business leaders think about the balance of relevance So being relevant, as in what are the risks that are potentially going to destabilize your business?
Yes.
With ambition. So where do you want to be in the future? What do you want to stand for? What is your vision? Because often we get too caught up in that first one and forget that the future is created by us. So we need to create that vision.
100%.
Love that. Sherry, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I think, my space was going kind of where Joe was, but I think typically we tend to be really strong, our teams tend to be really strong in making the business case and having the numbers and showing the penetration, potential gains, and all of those sorts of things. But oftentimes, especially with senior management, and especially over the past few years, the link to the actual human, understanding what it's like in their home, seeing how they stock behind their cabinets, hearing them talk about how they're diluting certain products because, they're trying to make it stretch and make ends meet. I think bringing that human component to it is critical, whether that's being done by bringing them in like the voice of the consumer, like Joe said, whether it's being with them in their homes. I think that's really, really powerful. And, we don't do it often enough. I think in the insights team and the innovation teams, yes, we're with consumers either virtually or in their homes. Or in store. Yeah. But I think as you get to management and some of those people who, like we were talking about, you really need to, how are your consumers feeling? How do we want to make them feel? That's a really powerful thing that no individual employee can stand up there and do. Seeing it on a video and, seeing someone in their bathroom or hearing about some of their trade-offs or how they're thinking about their family's health is so powerful. And they put into words into things that we can't, and it brings a level of authenticity and a level of persuasion.
Great. It's really, really great. I think it's really interesting because, one of the things that Ujwal taught me, going back almost a decade was the way in which kind of a person's beliefs can consistently kind of maintain a slope that goes up. And yes, there will be behaviors that will kind of, force themselves on us because of circumstance or because, kind of a pandemic lands. But, in essence, people will always kind of try and go back to their core set of values and their core set of beliefs. And if we can look at those beliefs and understand groups of consumers that share those beliefs, and if those relate to kind of a problem that we're trying to solve, it's really an amazing opportunity to kind of catch the wave as culture is moving in a particular direction. And, I know we talked right at the beginning of this panel discussion about the difference between, kind of immediate trends that need to be addressed versus kind of, 2 years out, 5 years out, even 10 years out. It's a task that I think a lot of people on this call are kind of struggling with, which is how do we focus on kind of short-term opportunities that can have this really strong impact for a business today, but how can these also basically be tied to a longer-term initiative or a longer-term plan that, we're really working towards? Like, what is that? How are we going to meet consumers where they are 5 years from now so that, kind of the things that we're doing today are not just independent of today, but part of a bigger kind of insight or innovation picture that is really going to help the organization kind of be one step ahead of the competition. So 3 amazing answers, and just really, really exciting to kind of hear that, you guys are working on that at your organizations. And I think that'll be really helpful for a lot of people who are listening.
Yeah, and inspiring, I think. And I know we have 4 minutes left and all of you have meetings to get to. What I thought I'd do is take a minute to try my best to capture some of the key points that we've talked about today, and then hand the mic back to each of you just for some parting notes. And
to judge Ujwal and see if he was doing really, really good.
My listening skills, yeah. We actually covered quite a bit of ground today. I think some of the important concepts, some of the key things that I really, starred in my notebook. I think one big area we talked about is this whole idea of the consumer kind of waking up and realizing, hey, I want more and more agency. And part of that agency journey is asking challenging questions, challenging their own assumptions about what they use, why they use it, what they buy. Part of that, we also talked about why it's important to not just always look at the happy stuff, the good stuff that's happening, but to also challenge our own internal thinking to understand, because it's the only way we're going to truly get to the human condition, because all of us as human beings deal with the good and the bad every single day. We have really terrible moments during the day and really amazing moments during the day. And we all hope for more amazing moments than terrible moments, but it's life. And if we don't understand both sides of the equation, we're missing out on the essence of what makes a human being human. A couple of other things that I really noted. We talked a little bit about how to drive. It's not just about looking at the why behind some of these shifts, not just about understanding the emotional side of the equation, but it's also important to then take that and drive change and drive inspiration within the organization. Joe, I'm paraphrasing here, but you said it's important to balance relevance with vision. I think that's a fantastic point because it's so often people get stuck in one or the other. And it's really, this is not an easy thing to do. You have to have one eye on the future and one eye on where you sit today and be really honest about where you sit today, as opposed to, kind of being stuck in your own little world. So I think there's just so many aspects that you all covered, and I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to be part of this. I think I could easily have this conversation for another 5 hours with you all, and maybe we'll get to do another one of these sessions in the future. But just curious if you had any parting notes, any final thoughts. Joe, we can start with you.
Yeah, I'm gonna just repeat that word, curious. I think that there is a lot more that we can dig into to help our businesses make more informed and more impactful decisions by being curious about human beings, and certainly by leveraging work through, the field of anthropology and really trying to understand the meaning behind these things that we're seeing inside of culture. So don't just read the trend reports, but really dig into them and try to ask a lot of questions about what it may mean and what it may not mean.
That's great. Erica?
Yeah. Thank you again of having me today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I would build on what Joe just mentioned, and I love how she really emphasized that curiosity. I think it's extremely important for all of us as a marketers, as a brand builders, to have that curiosity at the center, because all of us need to be prepared. The world will change even faster. The trend, we probably will have doubling the number of trend reports in the next years. So there are more things happen. I think most important is to maintain that curiosity. Otherwise, we will be bombarded by a lot of things that we have to do. But maintain that curiosity will guide us on what's relevant to us, what we have to do, and what we choose not to do. I think that is fundamentally most important as we look to short-term, mid-term, long-terms going forward.
Fantastic. Sherry?
Yeah, in closing, I absolutely love the idea of curiosity and how we start to generate that internally and keep it moving. I also think what we saw today was, encouraging when we thought about the curiosity that we're seeing from consumers and their ability and their decision making and their agency. And that to me is really encouraging and kind of leads a long, hopefully bright road ahead for us as manufacturers.
That's amazing. I couldn't have ended that better. Sherry, Erica, Joanna, thank you so much for being part of this. So appreciate it. And for all of you on the session, I know we could not get to a bunch of these questions.
I answered some of them in the chat. I answered some in the chat. So.
And please do not hesitate to reach out, but we will also make sure any unanswered questions, you will receive an email back. And we're more than happy to do a follow-up. Again, thank you to our panel, and thank you to all of you for attending.